Mr. David Roberts.
Shame, man.
What a pleasure to be with you at the end of day one. What a fantastic day we've all had together. It's been incredible, and we get to end it with you. We're very excited. For the first question, I want to ask you, I remember so vividly sitting in the bush with you, sitting at the table. I think it was like, late February 2020, and you started telling us that, people do not understand what is coming to the world. You started saying that this COVID story that's coming out of Wuhan is going to be a lot worse than the world is expecting. And now here we are 18 months later. Tell us, what has been the actual effect on the world and society?
I'll remind you too that the trip before that, we were in the vehicle and I told you that soon it was going to snow. It was going to hail. And then that big cloud came over and it was hailing. And I said, what's wrong with this picture? It's snowing in South Africa. This is the future of the world. Not predictable. Yeah. I think there's a key lesson that we have to grasp out of this. And either we learn the lesson painfully or we didn't learn it at all. And I love that it always goes back somehow to Clay Christensen and his theory of disruptive strategy. And rather than get into the theory, I want to remind you about this study that Harvard Business School did, and it really was a fantastic study. And they looked at the 300 top graduates that they'd had, and the 300 least top graduates that they had. And they didn't measure them just by their financial performance. They measured them by how happy were they? Were they living a fulfilled life? Were they healthy? Did they have strong connections? Did they feel like they were making an impact? And they got this 300 alumni together and asked them the question about their determined strategy for their life and their business and how important that was. So if you remember, the determined strategy are the things that we think of when we think of strategy, which is how do we get a group of people together and look at our strengths and our weaknesses and our threats and our opportunities and our core competencies and all this stuff to figure out what should we do and how should we do it over the next 5 or 10 years. And that's this determined strategy. And they asked them what I think is just this extraordinary question, which is, how important was your determined strategy to the extraordinary success that you've had? And this truly stunning answer came back, which was that 94% of that top 300 had said that their determined strategy was not important at all. It was not significant at all. And that instead it was what Clay called this emergent strategy. It was the adaptability and the flexibility to pursue new opportunities that came up, or to adapt and change because the environment changed. And this, to me, it's an unexpected answer. And I think what we've learned through this COVID experience is our adaptability and our flexibility and our emergent strategy. If you didn't get that right, and you weren't lucky enough to have a business that would have succeeded anyway in COVID, you're probably not in business anymore, or your business is really hurting. And this is the lesson for the future, and it's the lesson that Darwin learned in those Galapagos Islands, which is that unlike the bush, where you think that it's the biggest animal or the fiercest animal or the fastest runner, or none of those things were the success factor. None of them. As tempting as it is to think that it is these strengths that allow us to succeed, Darwin proved without any doubt that those things aren't it, that the only one in the long term that mattered was adaptability. And so those businesses that were able to adapt in the new COVID and post-COVID environment succeeded and did well, and those that didn't adapt, no matter how successful they were before, suffered. And I think that's the lesson. Darwin.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. And, we've certainly had to adapt very fast. And, it seems like the whole world has moved into this virtual reality. And, how important is this technology? And, a lot of people are talking about these metaverses and how, we're going to start living almost in this alternate reality. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, for first, kudos that you did a lot of your conference in virtual reality. And I have to admit, that was a lot earlier than I ever expected. I thought, when would I be in a virtual conference, or when would I attend a conference that was mostly virtual? So kudos to you for doing that probably a decade before I thought that might happen. Make no mistake here. Virtual reality is not just here to stay. Virtual reality is probably one of the top 3 most significant technologies for the future of humanity. I say it without hyperbole. The reason that virtual reality is so critical is that it's not a technology, it's a domain. It's a domain like reality is a domain. So here's, I think, the reason that it's so hard to get. In 1995, I was living in Aspen, Colorado, and there was a friend of mine. He was a toxicologist, and we used to ski together. And I remember he invited me over to his house for dinner, and we lived kind of right on the mountain. And at his house, we go down into his basement because he wanted to show me something he was doing on his computer. And having a computer, even in that time, it wasn't quite as common. People that were sort of at that edge had computers. And he takes me down into his basement, and he says, I want to show you this thing. And he gets on his computer, and there's some graphical stuff that we're looking at. And he says, this isn't on my computer. This is on other people's computers. And then he types in some other weird character stuff, and he's like, and this is also on some other people's computers. And I remember when I left his house, I was thinking that there was something that wasn't right about what he was doing, and that he was getting on other people's computers, and that somehow people were going to find out about it. And what he showed me was the World Wide Web. He showed me one of the first Netscape browsers. And I didn't get it. I was a technologist. And I had a software company at the time. And I remember leaving his house and just thinking, that dude is on other people's computers. He's getting on other people's computers, and there's something a little off about that. And so this is my point. when we look at virtual reality today, I believe that we are all having an experience that is not that different than the one that I was having at that time. And let me explain it a little more. We've spent a lot of time over the last few years talking about disruption and competition and strategy. But one of the key things that we always zeroed in on was how disruption is not competition, how it's not competition. Cars and horses didn't compete. They competed, what it looked like they were competing for a few years. But there were some roads that were built, and there was a horse lane and a car lane, and there were rules about how cars had to deal with horses when and there were people at the time that thought that we were always going to have both forever. But cars don't compete with horses. They disrupt horses. We didn't end up with cars and horses. We only ended up with cars. Virtual reality does not compete with reality. Virtual reality disrupts reality. In our future, in humanity's future, we exist in virtual reality. And we will rarely ever go back to reality. And this is a very hard concept to get. And why is it so important to get this? Because people that understand inevitability, if you understand inevitability, it means that you can make decisions in your present that are markedly different than others. And so people that understand this do actually make decisions that are very different in their future than what the world thinks is normal. When Elon Musk invested enormous amounts of money in electric cars and solar, there were a lot of people that thought, oh, that's crazy. General Motors just got rid of all those electric cars. And here he is starting something new up. And nobody's ever going to drive an electric car again. And who's going to buy an expensive electric car? Those decisions, they look absurd. Or, when Bill Gates started getting into the businesses and things that he got into, it just seemed crazy at the time. So there's an extreme advantage to people that can understand things that are inevitable, because they can place bets that other people think are crazy. And these bets are what I call asymmetric bets, because they give asymmetric rewards. And to make asymmetric bets, we have to have asymmetric knowledge about the future. We have to understand and know things about the future that other people don't understand. So let's get back to this question you had about virtual reality. For something to disrupt and not be competitive, it has to be able to not only do everything for the most part that the old thing can do, but it has to be able to do things that the old thing can never do. And so cars could get you from one place to another, but you didn't have to feed them every day. You could get inside some horse carriages and things, but slowly the speed started to exceed horses. There were things that horses were never going to be able to do. The biggest one was that cars didn't leave manure all over the place. And that may not sound like a problem, but in New York, that was the biggest problem of the entire city. And no one even had a solution for that future. Nobody could figure out how to get rid of all the manure. I mean, I have some great photos from the past. It's kind of gross to talk about, but the manure is piled up 8 or 9 feet high. 8 or 9 feet high. And so just the health problems that were coming from this. And so his solution not only did what a horse could do, but it then could do all these other things. So let's think now about virtual reality. If I'm in virtual reality, which in some weird way, we are doing this in a way, a little bit like virtual reality. But what it means is, if I needed to get to South Africa, I mean, a couple hundred years ago, I'd have to get on a ship. I'd have to cross the ocean. If I was in California, I'd have to go all the way down through the bottom of South America and come around. I mean, it would have taken me 2 or 3 years. And I probably wouldn't have made it. Good chance I might not have made it. In virtual reality, is snap a finger and I'm there. In virtual reality, I snap my finger and I've got Air Force One. And I make a copy of it and I give you an Air Force One. And then we meet in, say, Antarctica. I mean, things that are not, there's no limitation. The constraints of reality, the physics of reality don't exist. You and I, we could just go zero gravity right now. We'll float around and have this conversation. And so, because of the elimination of all the physical constraints of reality, it's part of why we make this journey. And when I say we, I mean humanity starts to live more and more in virtual reality. And there's a point that we don't come back. So when I tell this story, people think that's ridiculous, or that's so far into the future that we never have to worry about it. But I want you to grasp how far virtual reality has already come. I mean, already we're operating at almost retinal level. The sound in virtual reality is almost indistinguishable from reality. And vision and sound are the primary ways that we're experiencing our world. I mean, sometimes we use touch and taste and smell. And the truth is that we actually have not, 5 senses. We have 33 of them, best we can tell. So you and I, we have a sensor that says that we're upright right now. And even if you take away our 5 senses, we got this little vestibular part of our ear that has these little grains of sand in these tubes, and it'll actually tell us that we're upright and that we're not upside down. And so, but here's this point. If we're already at the point where virtual reality is approaching reality, it's only been 20 years. And 20 years is like a blink. And it's an exponential technology. It's doubling. Some say it's doubling at roughly every 5 or 6 months. It's either halving in price or it's doubling in its capabilities. So where do you think we'll be in 50 years? I mean, the virtual reality that we have today is the worst virtual reality we will ever have. In 5 years, we will look back and think how terrible that virtual reality that we had 5 years ago was. Here's the other critical thing to get, and it's worth us spending, I think, another 5 or 10 minutes to talk about this, because if you get it, then you realize how important virtual reality is to our future. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, Peter mentioned this morning in the opening, he spoke about how, we may be citizens of South Africa and we may be citizens of another metaverse. And I mean, and he's being like absolutely dead serious, yeah, So,
yeah. Peter has a really brilliant ability, I think, to see that future. He can see that future. That future is very, very real to him. And the point that he's making there is even underestimated as to what happens in that future. For example, here's what I think can help us grasp this. We already live in virtual reality. We already live in a world that's not very real. I mean, this table looks like a solid table to me, but I know from middle school physics that there's not one solid thing in this table. I mean, this table is made of atoms in waveforms, and there's not one solid non-moving thing here. And the only reason, in fact, it's 99.9999999% space. The only reason I can't push my fingers through the table has nothing to do with the matter stopping me. It's all about the fact that the electromagnetic forces prevent me from doing it. And so we don't live in reality. This world doesn't look anything like this. This is our dumbed down version of the world. Our brain creates a dumbed down version. Let's get into a little bit of the biology of this. We used to think that our eyes saw the world. We used to think that when I look at this room, when you look at the room that you're in, you think that you are looking at the room, that the light from the room comes through our cornea and hits the back of our retina, and that our brain then moves that image of the retina to our visual cortex in the back of our brain, and then our brain looks at that image. But we know now that that's actually not at all what happens. It's crazier than that. Instead, what happens is that inside of the neural net of our cells, because when the image falls on the back of our retina, that image doesn't get moved. It gets converted into just electrical pulses, little pulses on the nerves. The back of your retina is part of your brain. It's not a separate function. It's part of your brain. And your brain then is somehow converting these pulses on the neurons into a conception that we're in something like a room. If you look at that image, so it's like something that looks like a chessboard. So A is one of the dark squares on the chessboard, and B is one of the light squares on the chessboard. Now, it turns out that this is an optical illusion. And the illusion that exists is that the square A is exactly the same shade and color as the square B. And so how does that happen? Why do we think that? And you have to look at the next image to actually believe me, because when you look at it, that can't be true. I mean, square A and square B are clearly not the same color. And then in the next image, you'll see there's a line that goes through it that is actually the same color as both of the squares. And then you can actually compare that line to the squares to see that the color really is the same. But the reason that this optical illusion works is even more crazy. And the reason that it works has nothing to do with your eyes. It's because when you look at this image, you then create this in your head, in your mind. And in that process of the creation in your mind, your brain takes into account the shadow from that cylinder and knows what chessboard looks like. And so it creates that illusion that square A and square B are different colors. It's not an optical illusion, it's a mind illusion. And we create the world in our mind. So why does all this matter? It matters because what it means is that virtual reality, eventually, not only does it equal reality, but it has all these other benefits. Material costs nothing. Transportation costs nothing. Time may not even be the same. In other words, let's say we speeded up virtual reality, and at the same time we speeded up my brain too. If virtual reality and my brain got speeded up, everything would still seem like it was happening at the same speed. But the whole virtual reality might be running at 100 times or 1,000 times faster than reality. So if you grasp this, and it's a hard concept to grasp, what it means is that humanity, the future of humanity is in VR. And
it's scary.
My very belief is that this is why we don't see a lot of life in the rest of the universe. Because my belief is that, so when single cell organisms became multicellular organisms, the single cell organisms could no longer experience the multicell thing. When fish came out of the ocean, they just disappeared from the domain of the ocean. All the things in the ocean, except for maybe, dolphins and fish that would jump out every once in a while, they disappeared to them. And humankind goes into virtual reality and seemingly disappears from reality. I know this is a strange conversation to be having, but it's critical to get, because things, and this is why, understanding inevitability gives extreme advantages to those that do not understand inevitability. If you understand the future of CRISPR-Cas9, being able to edit digital biology, you can now make investments in companies and in medicine that other people would not make investments in. If you understand the future of crypto NFTs, and you understand that a group of people will suddenly, 1,000 people can invest in a piece of property, like stock, the way we invest in a company. You buy little shares of stock, and you own a bit of a company. And that suddenly, because of NFTs, we are going to be able to do that with real estate. Then you'll understand the future of real estate is about this NFT concept, and you will be able to make decisions that put you well in advance. Flying cars are inevitable. They're inevitable because they'll be electric and they'll be quiet and they'll transport you from one location to another without having to take curvy roads and drive around lakes and rivers, and without having to build unbelievably expensive bridges and roads. I mean, a highway costs $8 million a mile. I mean, for the cost of one highway across South Africa, you could probably buy every person a passenger drone. And so what it means is that Africa will never have to build the trillions of dollars of roads that are needed to bring South Africa into a first world state. You'll never have to do it. Just like you never had to lay all those landlines down when we thought that the world was going to be made of landline phones. And because the entire continent of Africa was behind on that, it allowed them to leapfrog into the future and skip all of those infrastructure costs when cell phones came. And then they only had to build the towers. And then Africa ended up actually being highly advanced and at the edge of cell phones. Virtual reality is no different. Virtual reality is the domain where humanity moves. Our future is in matter, not in this physical world. And it's not just because it's better. It's because we actually get better too. We get to move into virtual reality and have 1 million tastes and 1 billion colors. So if you can be in that reality, why would you ever come back to this?
Absolutely. So it's intriguing and scary, and it's very hard to grasp. I mean, how important is leadership in this new world, in this new future? Because I mean, it's just so far out there. And what's the most important thing that you could tell us about leadership that you've seen happen, say, over this last period?
Yeah. I think watching what happened during our periods of COVID has helped me to understand a little bit more about where the source of the problems that we're experiencing in our organizations and in our countries and in our government come from. And it's a troubling answer. It's a troubling answer because what I've realized is that the source of the problems that we have in society are not the problems of society, but they're the problems of the individual mind. In other words, because we have troubled minds, that then gets reflected in our organizations and in groups of people. Peter Diamandis often talks about mindset, and I think mindset is a critically important concept. Even more important than mindset is the state of mind that we have. Meaning, if we are anxious, if we are fearful, if we are depressed, then these states are contagious, like the COVID virus is contagious. And so anxious people create anxious people around them. Fearful people create fearful people around them. Joyful people creating joyful people around them. And so the pinnacle of leadership is understanding the true source of leadership, which comes from our state of mind. If we understand this insight, we start to realize then the power that we hold to change not only our own life, but to change others. Maybe it's better telling it in a couple anecdotes or stories. The very short one is, two prisoners look through prison bars. One sees mud, the other sees stars. Two minds can be in the same circumstance, but be in a very different state. One can be anxious, troubled, fearful, depressed, angry, and the other can be in a state of joy and bliss and love and caring and compassion and courage. Which do you think the greater leader is going to come from? So how would we get there? And I'll tell it in another story. It's a kind of a difficult story to get. It's an old story from India. These two monks are walking along a river. They come across a woman, and she's crying. She's very upset. And so they have the conversation with her, and she says, "Well, I crossed the river this morning, and now I need to cross the river to get back home. But the river has gone up because of the rains, and I can't cross it. And my child is across the river. My child is going to be alone tonight." And it creates this anxiousness, fearfulness. And so the senior monk walked over and picked up the woman and carried her across the river. And the other monk followed and put her down on the other side, and then she went off to her child. And as they walked down the rest of the path, you could tell that the other monk was very troubled by this silence for 5-10 minutes. And finally, he gains the courage to speak up, and he says to the other monk, he says, "You know what you did." And the monk that carried the woman across said, "Yes, I know what I did." And he says, we were told to never even look, to make eye contact with a woman. And you touched her. Not only did you touch her, you picked her up, you carried her across the river. And the senior monk says, "Yes." And then I put her down and I walked away. But it's you that is still carrying her. meaning the less experienced monk was still troubled by this, was still living in a state of angst. And because he had pulled the past into his present, he was living in this anxious angst and a state that was troubling him, and now was trying to trouble his senior monk with it too. But the other monk was already past and gone and had let it go. And so the other monk was living in a higher state. And this is where I think leaders need to go. This is where we need to go. We need to recognize that a conflicted mind leads to conflicted organizations. You know, I've been watching this last year, this conflict that happens between those that think we should not wear masks, and think we should wear masks, or think we should get the vaccine, or think we shouldn't get the vaccine, or think we should assemble, or think we can't assemble. And this conflict is not just in the organizations. The conflict exists in our mind. There's a wonderful woman named Sri Pritashi, and she wrote a book. I'm trying to remember it now. The 4 Sacred Secrets. And I would encourage the reading of this book for leaders, because it helps greatly to understand how to move from the mind that we just inherited into a more awakened and enlightened state. Because great leaders can't come from fearful, anxious, depressed minds. They can't come from that. Great innovation, great creativity, great compassion, all of the great things about us don't come from these lower states. And so, as Gandhi always said, you know, if you want to change the world, you change yourselves. But this is what he's speaking really about. If you want to change yourself, you change the way you think. And it's not about the thinking, it's about the emotions that come with it. And so great leaders, if they have not already reached this as a goal, should have for themselves the goal of self-transformation, of transforming themselves where they are always in a beautiful state, and they recognize that the environment around them does not affect or change their state. The state, that beautiful state that they have, is a choice that we make. And it's a choice, not the environment. We are not a reflection of that. And if we make the choice of the beautiful state, then we realize that the ultimate pursuit of humanity, the ultimate pursuit that we should have for ourselves, is to sort of move beyond these states of negative emotion. They're suffering states. So if we can free ourselves from fear, from anxiety, from anger, if we can free ourselves from this, then our organizations are also freed from it. And it's from these higher states that we gain creativity, innovation. It's these practices that transform organizations. I'll tell one last story, and I remember telling it once several years ago, actually in South Africa. It was in one of your conferences, but I don't think that people got the story. Maybe it's worth me telling it again in light of what I just said. And it's a story about sort of one of the last samurai. I'll explain the story a little bit before I tell it. And then at least I think it will help in understanding it. Because even when I heard it, I didn't get it for the longest time. And I think it was many months later when I really got the story. And the story represents the future and the past and our emotions that are attached to those. And it represents the ability for us to not be affected negatively by the thoughts around the past or the future, and to not constantly keep bringing them in a negative way into our present, destroying our state. And in the destruction of that state, destroying our ability to have positive emotions that free us from suffering and lead us to beautiful states. The samurai is being chased by a bear and running for his life from this bear. And as he's running, he can see ahead that there's a cliff. And he's trying to make the choice. He's not going to get eaten by the bear, but he looks like he's going to have to run and jump off this cliff, which he chooses to do. And of course, now he's falling down the cliff, and as he's falling, he hits a tree that's sticking out of the cliff. And he looks up, and he can see the bear growling above him. His past. And as he's sitting, he realizes that the branch is not fully stable, and he looks down, and he can see a tiger beneath him, growling and leaping up, trying to grab him in the anticipation of his future. And the branch is now also starting to break. And on the branch, you can see there's a strawberry vine, and there are some strawberries. And he reaches out and grabs a strawberry and puts it in his mouth and says, "Ah, delicious." I hope that story sits with you as you think about a new level of leadership in an anxious, dynamic, changing world filled with disruption, competition. That it is not the outside world that determines our state. We choose that. And from higher levels of state come greater levels of creativity, innovation, adaptiveness, strategy, planning, all of the great traits that we have that enable us to succeed in a dynamically changing environment come forth as we maintain these beautiful states.
David Roberts, always a privilege and a pleasure to spend time with you. That was absolutely fantastic. You've got the ability, in my opinion, to inspire through the virtual reality. That was fantastic. But I must say, I am looking forward to seeing you in reality.
Yes, me too. I look forward to being there. And I think next year, I think this COVID thing will still have these peaks and valleys. But I do think that those peaks will start to diminish, and then my sense is the next year we'll be able to meet in person, and it'll be wonderful to see you there and to see many of your clients and customers there too. So I look forward to that.
Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure to do this with you, and thank you for the great work you do for Africa and South Africa, and my blessings and hopes to all the other listeners in Africa and South Africa, and I look forward to getting to be with you in person too. So, gracious thanks.
We look forward to that. Thank you so much, man.
Cheers.